We start our trip to the Marvel West in Two Gun Kid and the Sunset Riders. Much like Batman 3 Jokers, Two Gun is actually a series of graphic novels, which totally surprised me, that were originally published in November and December of 1995. I actually had little to no interest in buying this series, because one, it is the farthest away from the rest of the series that we'll be exploring, and two, it picks up on character threads that were published decades before even this comic was originally published, and I'm not familiar with those plot threads at all. And three, it was published in 1995, and as much as I love the 90s, it's when I started reading comics after all. I have bought so many of Marvel's 90s era comic books. My love for this era does not blind me to its faults. If you were not a Spider-Man book or an X-Men comic in the 90s, well, you probably sucked. That obviously does not apply to everything, but it does apply to any short series that is not based on a hugely successful franchise at the time. Something like, I don't know, say, a graphic novel series starring a cowboy character that hasn't appeared in 20 years in a genre that doesn't sell well anymore in the 90s, much less nowadays in the 2020s. As such, Sunset Riders was actually the last Western comic that I purchased, and we can blame our next series for that fact. Blaze of Glory, which is going to be our next book, acknowledges the events of Sunset Riders and features a character who only appears in this comic. So, continuity demands that I get this. And in buying it, I discovered that Sunset Riders was written by Fabian Nicieza, who is one of my all-time favorite authors, especially in the 90s. Nicieza wrote for a time X-Force, the first Cable miniseries, some of Cable's ongoing series, Cable and Deadpool, New Warriors, Night Thrasher, Nova, the Justice miniseries, the second Deadpool miniseries, the Nomad miniseries, the Nomad ongoing series, Thunderbolts, Gambit's first ongoing series, and, of course, a decent chunk of the first part of X-Men Volume 2. He is a skilled writer who enjoys adding in real-world events and drama to his superheroes, using the costumes to explore reality and how we process it. He has a solid grasp on his characters as well, balancing their growth with story progression. Learning that Nicieza wrote these graphic novels, I actually got really psyched up. At the very least, I knew that this was going to be a good read. It was drawn by Christian Gorny, inked by Michael Halblieb, colored by Marie Javins, with a mysterious special art assist credit by Alex Maleev. This bit of research is what made me nervous, as I have never heard of Christian Gorny. According to my research, Gorny is a German artist who worked on several comics in Europe in the mid-90s. These included Harmon, ABC van der BRD, some work for the German edition of Heavy Metal, as well as the comic Almanac. He also wrote and drew a graphic novel called Narcangel, all of which sounds pretty impressive to me. He then teamed up with no less than Alan Moore of Watchmen fame to produce the Outbreaks of Violet's trading card series, which were made for the 1995 MTV European Music Awards with other European artists. That is one hell of a pedigree. So now we've got a great writer and a pretty prolific, just not in the United States, artist on board, and that doesn't sound all that bad. That's the real-world background, so let's cover some of the comic book background. This is the stuff that this particular series picks up upon. You see, back in Avengers issue 141, which was published in 1975, 20 years before this comic was published, for various reasons, the Avengers went on a time travel adventure and traveled to the Old West. They teamed up with a number of Western heroes, including the Two Gun Kid, and by the end of it, they invited the Two Gun Kid to the future. And he said yes, because that's what you do when you're traveling through time. You just muck about no matter what's going to happen. After a time, Two Gun returned to the past in order to live out the rest of his life, but with one damning bit of knowledge. Matt Hawk, the Two Gun Kid, knew when he was going to die. That day is today, April 28th, of 1885. What a way to start an adventure. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.2, The Two-Gun Kid and the Sunset Riders. The story opens with lawyer Matt Hawk dying, his law offices being consumed by a fiery explosion. This conflagration is meant to distract the authorities and onlookers who are in the town of Tombstone in order to watch a man hang. That man is Marcel Fournier, a black French-Canadian who has been tried for, and found guilty of, murder. But Matt knew that Marcel was innocent, and although he had failed him in court, he would not fail him in life. Matt Hawk died, his Avengers ID card burning in the fire, so that the Two-Gun Kid could save Marcel. The plot for this book from here on out is super convoluted, so I'm going to try and simplify things for us all and just cut to the chase. The overall plot of the series is revealed in full in the final issue or chapter of the graphic novel. This is not something that is explained early on or even really alluded to until we get to it. About 50 years ago, a team of Russian and Japanese explorers explored Alaska, hoping to chart this relatively unexplored, by their own culture's experience, lands. The harsh weather reduced their number to just 2, one of each party, but they did make an amazing discovery. Determined to not lose this location, they drew a map on a seal hide. Half of it was written in Japanese, the other half was written in Russian. They died before they could take full advantage of this discovery, though. 48 years later, another group, this one made of Russian merchants, raided an Eskimo village, desperate for supplies. Inside of one of their structures, they found this map, collected off of the dead bodies at some point and displayed as a curiosity. These Russian explorers took the map, contacted a Japanese shipping combine, and formed a partnership. However, at this point, Alaska was now a U.S. territory, and so they would need to be, circumspect in how they went about acquiring the treasure. The map was shown to the Russian Tsar and the Japanese Emperor at the time, and then they went to work getting access to it. So, we now have Fournier acting as an agent of the Canadian government, ferrying the Golden Minks. Stitched inside the pelts of these minks, which were shown as being alive at the start of this book, so I am not 100% sure of what's going on with the minks, are metal pellets. Inside of these metal pellets are the two halves of the map, translated, which reveal the location of the treasure. Fournier was supposed to transport these minks back to Canada. But without the actual map, the two translated pieces are useless. This map has been hidden, glued to the back of a Japanese scroll called the Kakemono. But the scroll was stolen from the Japanese, and I cannot seem to find an explanation for who stole the scroll originally. There's a moment where the various other parties involved in this whole mess get together, and one of the men present thinks to himself that this has all gone wrong. The minks and the scroll were meant to stay lost, and Fournier was supposed to die. This guy clearly did not want the treasure to be found. But then he says that he suggested that they hire a seasoned cowboy in order to transport everything because he wouldn't have failed. That implies that this guy wants this mission to succeed, though. And he says that they should have hired a cowboy instead of the Russian. And then the man enters a room, and a man named Anatoly Fiskov is there, eager to clean up this mess. I'm assuming that Fiskov was the man hired to transport the scroll and swap it for Fournier's minks, but this American agent, who is representing the American government, was trying to keep all of these foreign powers from finding this treasure. But Fournier now lives thanks to the effort of the Two-Gun Kid, and the cavalry has yet to succeed in killing him. Because, he's protected by the Two-Gun Kid. As they ride out of town, Two-Gun and Fournier ride into a box canyon, meaning that there's no way out. This freaks out Fournier, who doesn't seem to want to die, understandably, but Two-Gun is calm and cool about everything. His trail leads him over a marked stone grave. The marker reads Fred and Wilma, and a thick piece of rope winds up from the stones over the grave marker. As they ride past it, Two Gun grabs the rope and pulls out a sack. Once they reach the end of the canyon, Two Gun pulls out 2 guns from the sack. But they aren't 6-shooters, they're automatics from the future. So when the cavalry rounds the corner intent on killing their prey, Two Gun just mows them all down, somehow managing to neither kill any of the men or their horses, which I kinda think is unlikely, but evidently that's just how good a shot the Two Gun Kid is. The rest of the first chapter is then spent at a campsite, giving Two Gun and Fournier time to get to know one another. Marcel explains that he has been chartered by the Canadian and US governments to transport something very important, the golden minks. He was attacked by men who were trying to steal this item, and so he killed them. As far as he's concerned, he was defending himself, and this is what he was on trial for. Matt then explains about having knowledge of the future. He doesn't go into much detail, and yet he still seems to expect Marcel to believe him about this. And I get it, Matt did travel to the future, that happened, but who was going to believe that idea in 1885? H.G. Wells's The Time Machine wasn't even published until 1895, so the concept of traveling through time hadn't even been popularized in culture yet. Matt should really just sound like a crazy person to Fournier. But this scene establishes a strange bond between the two men. Marcel can't go into detail about his mission, and Matt can't really explain that he was ready to die because history said that he died back there. These two men can't quite trust each other, but they also can't afford to trust anyone else either. This bit of the chapter is perhaps the single best part of this entire chapter. During our hero's kinetic, frantic escape, we cut away to Chicago, Illinois, and this is actually where we meet Anatoly Fiskov inside of a barbershop. His second, a man named Vyacheslav, is reporting intelligence on Marcel and Two Gun's escape. While he is upset about this complication, Anatoly has to admit that he loves this country. He thinks this stuff is just fun. As he's getting a leisurely shave, the barber holds his knife just shy of Fiskov's throat. He's hesitating, though, and Fiskov notices. Fiskov pushes the barber back. "If you take a job, then you need to finish it." Fiskov grabs the barber by his throat. Who was foolish enough to hire him as a killer? The barber glances to his left, at an old Japanese man. This man was sweeping the floor, but he starts when Fiskov turns his attention to him. The man then draws a blade from his sleeve, and in the name of the Emperor, he cuts his own throat. Blood spatters on Anatoly's shirt, which annoys him. He grabs the barber by the throat again and crushes it, relishing the challenge that now stands before him. You know, I like Fiskov. He is a fun villain. He doesn't get nearly enough time to shine in this book, but I like what little bit we get with him. Chapter 2 sees Two Gun and Fournier visiting with a small tribe of Sibique Apache, who found Fournier's lost golden minks. When asked about what they plan to do next, our two men answer differently. Two Gun wants to stand and fight. Fournier wants to run. Again, they are at odds with one another. Ultimately, they leave, heading for the west coast. One of the Sibique is a young man named Running Fish, and he is similarly torn. Should the Sibique aid Two Gun and fight the cavalry, or should they run? They're peaceful by nature, but Running Fish knows that Americans in general are not, so he climbs on top of a stone tower and meditates on it. When he reaches his decision, he decides that they need to fight, and he climbs down, returns to his tribe, and finds that they have all been slaughtered. The cavalry came, pursuing Two Gun and Fournier, and killed everyone there. Running Fish buries his tribesmen and takes off after their killers. He then catches up with Two Gun and Fournier in San Diego. They're looking to charter a boat ride up to Seattle, and, after encountering some 1880s racism, manage to board a boat. Before the boat sets sail, though, the cavalry catches up and boards the boat as well, and they try to arrest our boys. This is when they are saved by Running Fish. They drive off the cavalry, and the captain of the boat, who is carrying less than legal cargo, rushes a takeoff. As they pull away, Matt and his allies watch the cavalry commandeer another boat for themselves, and Matt can't afford to let that happen. Ducking down into the hold, Matt opens up a chest that he picked up somewhere along the way, and he pulls out a flooping rocket launcher. He blows a hole in the other boat, isn't happy about killing the people on it, and they manage to get away. After all of the bungling of the cavalry, Mr. Aichi, the foreign minister of Japan, orders a samurai named Hijiro Niguri to solve this whole mess. And he seems pretty eager, declaring that the two-gun kid must die. It definitely reads as the ending of a comic book issue and not the chapter of a graphic novel. It's just so over the top. Our boys make it to San Francisco, which isn't where they were headed, by the way, so I don't know what happened there, but that's where Chapter 3 tells us they are. They're being attacked by, a platoon of samurai. Our boys defend themselves, but they're outnumbered, so it's only a matter of time until they are captured or killed, until Hijiro turns on his emperor and nation. Believing that their current course to be one without honor, he defends our heroes and joins their cause. After some cross-city battling, our band slows the samurai down long enough for Hijiro to call a truce. In Japanese, he explains to his countrymen that these men don't have the scrolls or the minks, and Fournier is the only one in the city with the skills to track them. So either the samurai can let them go, Fournier can hunt them down, and the samurai can then stop them later, or they can lose the minks forever. Trusting in Hijiro's personal sense of honor, their commander agrees to let them go. For now. Fournier voluntarily separates from the group here. He needs to hunt the minks down, and he can't do it with all the attention that this particular group brings. He promises to meet Two Gun in Alaska in a few days, and the gunman nods. Hijiro is the only one who notices that Fournier must have followed his conversation in Japanese. Despite the fact that this is pointed out like a plot point, nothing ever comes of it. After our boys escape the samurai, they're beset by the local police because they have been tearing up the town during, and I'm gesturing wildly at all of existence, all of this. Two Gun encourages the group to run, and they eventually get to a field where a bunch of hot air balloons are preparing to take off. Two Gun and Running Fish shoot all of the balloons but one, which they board in order to make their escape. Hijiro points out that they are putting a lot of faith in Fournier, but Two Gun isn't worried. They don't know Marcel like he does. He will be there. At the end of Chapter 3, Fiskov and his contacts produce the scroll. With deft skill, one of them pulls at it, and he peels the map from the back of it. This is the broad map of where the treasure is located, but without the pellets and the additional pieces of the map inside of those pellets, the map is useless. Which is when Marcel Fournier walks through the door, the golden minks in hand. It's time that they all became very rich men, he says. Chapter 4 has the boys work their way north, while Marcel gets the lowdown on what's been going on, and why, with Fiskov and his allies. A few of those conspirators get shot so that the survivors can get a bigger portion of the reward, but Fournier is not amongst them. As an experienced tracker, he is their best guide to get these men to the treasure. Basically, they need him alive. For now. Our remaining trio, meanwhile, finally make it by steamboat to Alaska. As they exit the ship, they are spied on by one of Fiskov's men. He pulls out a small handgun, but then he cries out. Falling over, a knife is revealed to be in his back. As our heroes turn around, surprised, they find Marcel watching their backs. He tells them that they have an 8-hour head start if they leave right now. And so they do. Traveling by dog sled, by foot, not resting once for 4 days, they push on. Fiskov's party will be too large. They're going to have to rest at some point. So, finally, our boys break camp and catch up. Unfortunately, Fournier still has no clue what the actual treasure is. It might be coal, maybe it's diamonds. The two-gun kid has a guess, but he's very vague about it, only referring to it as the future. Hijiro asks if he thinks the future is worth dying for. Two Gun holds out a bar that is just bigger than his hand. He sure hopes so, because they are all likely to die no matter what. Cheery. The next morning, our cast finds a small opening in an Alaskan mountainside. Fournier and Two Gun head inside, but the floor gives way underneath them. They careen down the interior, landing in some kind of liquid. Two Gun carefully lights a Zippo and reveals that they have fallen into oil. That's right. Texas tea, black gold, a whole mountain of the good old dino juice. This is what all of those world powers want. Whoever ends up getting the rights to this mountain, or illegal access to it, as our bad guys want, is going to be able to shape the future of the world. Running Fish and Hijiro, still up on the surface, get knocked out from behind, fall down into the cavern, and join Two Gun and Fournier. Fiskov reveals that he has teamed up with the American cavalry. Riding in shifts, they made it to the treasure site just after our heroes. But now, Two Gun knows that he and his friends can't leave here alive, right? Two Gun knows, and he doesn't plan to leave here alive. He urges his friends to leave, and he pulls out the brick that we saw earlier. That brick is made of highly explosive C4. He wires it up, sets a timer, and then runs deeper into the caves. The entire mountain, filled to the brim with crude oil, detonates. The Sunset Riders somehow made it far enough away to be pushed out of the mountain instead of killed. They roll down the crumbling mountainside until they fall into a gorge and then down into a river. They fight to breathe, but they make it, finally washing ashore. After some time, more cavalry show up, and our heroes basically just threaten them off of their horses. Fournier thinks that this particular group was probably a scouting unit, so he isn't worried about another unit backing them up anytime soon. But after they watched that mountain explode, they are panicky and a little bit nervous. So the cavalry give up their rides, and the Sunset Riders ride off into the sunset. Yeah, it's a super abrupt ending. It kind of feels like Niceza ended the story this way in order to keep things really opened up for a potential follow-up series. Given how many of Niceza's miniseries went on to become ongoing series, that does make some good sense, but it also gives Sunset Riders this really strange vibe. It feels like it just ended too soon, like there's no attempt to wrap up anybody's individual plot lines, there's no repercussions from any of the governments involved, despite them putting a lot of men and money into this operation, and of course our heroes just basically dust themselves off and leave at the end, which it just doesn't feel like an ending. I am more than a little annoyed at Niceza's overly convoluted plot as well. There are so many interested parties and moving pieces in this story. We don't track those items or the people carrying them very well either. Writing the summary for this episode actually helped to clarify a lot of my initial confusion, but honestly, I view that as a bad thing. When you need to produce like an hour-long podcast and spend 2 days picking apart a comic book in order to understand what its plot is, then you probably read a bad comic book. Even as I was recording this, I realized that I don't know when the Sunset Riders lost track of the Golden Minks in order for Fournier to find them again. I don't know what happened there. And I mean, I don't care that this book involves Vice President whoever the Floop, or the Russian Defense Minister, or the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs. Like, who are these people? Why should I care about any of them? I'm here for the Two Gun Kid and, by extension, the Sunset Riders. I don't give a crap about any of these political figures. Niceza included them in order to demonstrate the stakes of the story, that this isn't just a dime novel hero stopping a train robbery or a cattle rustler or some kind of owl hoot. This is Two Gun Kid thwarting a conspiracy that could lead to the First World War in 1885. It elevates Two Gun Kid from a cowboy part-timing as a hero to a superhero who literally saves the world. That's no small thing, but it is frustrating for me as a reader because so much time is spent with these almost nameless figures talking cryptically and manipulating things that we don't get to see, but which end up affecting our heroes, that we don't spend nearly enough time hanging with the Sunset Riders. In Niceza's defense, he does do some good work with our main cast. The 4 chapters of this graphic novel are basically 4 separate issues, just published in 2-issue collections. I'm assuming that this story was published this way because Gorney was living in Europe at the time, and remember, this comic was made in 1995. So getting the script to him very likely meant mailing a copy of it to Europe, then Gorney would need to draw the book, mail those pages back to America, where they were then colored and lettered and finally published. Selling this book as a 4-issue miniseries means scheduling that interaction 4 separate times. Selling it as a series of graphic novels means scheduling it twice. And that's a hell of a lot easier and probably a lot cheaper to do. But anyways, each chapter is narrated by one of our different characters. First is Fournier, second is Running Fish, third is Hijiro, and the final chapter is Two Gun. This bit of writing actually works really well. 3 of these 4 men have never appeared before Sunset Riders, so we are meeting them for the first time. Having each one of them narrate an issue allows us to get into their heads, follow their thoughts, learn their opinions. It's like a crash course in getting to know each of them, and it works really well. Fournier, for example, feels guilty right off the bat because Matt basically sacrificed his normal life in order to save him. But he knows that Canada is involved in a deal to steal something from the United States government. He's caught between loyalty to his nation and a debt to his friend. Running Fish was caught between his people's peaceful nature and his personal desire to fight for a better future. He is like his namesake, a running fish, uncomfortable on land and uncomfortable in the water, caught between his own 2 natures. So, ultimately, he makes the decision to fight back, hunts the cavalry, and joins our crew. Hijiro is torn between his duty to honor and doing the right thing, and obeying his emperor and nation. Finally, we have Two Gun, who is caught between life and death. Since learning from the future that he was going to die, he has tried to live a comfortable, normal life. He married the woman that he loved, but she died in childbirth. His daughter lived, but then died of cholera not long after. He has had nothing to live for since returning to the past, and he has just been waiting to die. And when his day to die came, he actually lived. But why? For what? And in helping his newfound friends and saving the world, he finds a reason to live again. Unfortunately, that reason seems to be just action and adventure and not something more meaningful, but hey, at the core of a Western is what? I believe that it is action and adventure. I super appreciate Niceza's use of Two Gun's trip to the future in this story. When you open the cover to the first volume, there's an introduction page featuring a stone grave with a marker that reads, "Here lies Fred and Wilma." They're a page right out of history. Originally, I took this to just be a joke, a cute reference to the Flintstones. But when Two Gun and Fournier are escaping the cavalry in issue 1, this is revealed to be the hiding place of Two Gun's machine guns from the future. So I actually think that it's super cute that Two Gun watched enough TV during his time in the future to fall in love with the Flintstones, a show that is set in the past, so that when he returned to the actual past, those are now nods to the future. They're a page right out of Two Gun's history, but they don't exist yet because they're from the future. Having Two Gun pull that rocket launcher and the C4 brick out was also cool. It actually took seeing Two Gun use Fred and Wilma for me to realize that he is shown using machine guns on the cover of the first volume. Using the future in order to affect the present is a constant theme throughout this story, which I think is super clever. This is mostly shown by Two Gun using future technology in order to defend the past, but it is also demonstrated by the bad guys wanting to claim the crude oil. Two Gun describes this as using the future to destroy the past, because he knows how important oil is to the world in a way that no one else in 1885 does. If Fiskov and his American allies got their hands on that oil here and now, not only would Fiskov become one of the richest men in the world, but America would become an even more dominant power than it eventually would. I do think that overall, the character work that is done with the Sunset Riders is pretty good. It's honestly the best part about this book. As a unit, they don't really feel like they ever come together. Like, they don't complement each other very well at all. They're just four people who have fallen in together because all of their individual enemies have allied against them. But, I mean, that's a good starting place for this group. Having the entire cast torn between two different needs or natures is really interesting, and it does help to kind of solidify them a little bit as a team. By the end of this book, they feel conceptually like a Western Avengers team. They're multinational, they're multi-ethnic, they have a wide and varied set of skills. That is all pretty cool, and I do kind of wish that there was some place that I could see more of their adventures together. Out of all of their enemies, Anatoly Fiskov is easily the most interesting one in the comic. He is a big dude, like he is an extra large dude where everyone else is a medium. He's tall, he's broad, he's very strong, he breaks someone's neck with one hand at one point in the story, but he is also totally in love with America and the opportunity that it represents. He's paired in this story with an underling named Vyacheslav, who always starts to speak in his native tongue, Russian, and Fiskov has to tell him to speak English. That is the language of the future in his mind, and he will not be left behind. I read online a couple of times that Fiskov is meant to be the ancestor of Wilson Fisk, who is better known as the Kingpin of Crime, constant thorn in the side of Daredevil. There is nothing within this actual comic that confirms this or denies this, but I do think that the idea is pretty neat. The rest of the enemies in this story don't stand out at all, and I won't lie, I'm honestly not sure of their connections to each other. We could have had just a solid antagonist in the man leading the cavalry, who believes in law and order, and Two Gun is breaking that law, but no, the cavalry are just kind of powerless. We could have had a solid antagonist in Fiskov, who is not only a crime boss, but a larger-than-average man, so he's got a good physical powerhouse-ness to him as well. But no, instead, Fiskov is one of 10 men trying to manipulate this plot, and he just kind of gets lost amongst all of that. I don't even fully know if Fiskov was connected to the Russian government, either as a legitimate agent or an illegitimate one, or is he just a crime boss? I don't know at all. All of the background manipulations that are going on are so lost on me. None of this is helped by the artwork, which I hate to say is bad. Really bad. Every panel in this book looks unfinished. Character faces often look like mashed potatoes to me. The framing is really bad in certain places, for example, in Chapter 2, Two Gun and Fournier are in a bar while they figure out their transport further north. They purchase 2 beers, and when it is brought to the table, we only see 2 hands holding the mugs over the table. We don't see anything else. Fournier thanks the waiter for the beers. We then cut to Matt, who is scowling, and then we cut to Fournier, who asks if there's a problem, and the mug is sitting down on the table in front of him. He looks like he is talking to Matt. In the next panel, though, the waiter says that they don't serve his kind here, referring to the fact that Fournier is black. But the way that the scene was presented to us, it looks like Matt was upset with Fournier, not the waiter, and for no reason, and so it just reads super awkward. The coloring of this series doesn't help either, looking equally unfinished and lacking in polish. The Two Gun Kid classically wears a vest of cowhide that is brown with black spots, but the spots are never drawn on here. They're only colored in, and that just makes them look more like stains than cowhide. Running Fish's skin tone actually changes from page to page. There's a moment when Fournier kills the assassin who was going to shoot our crew, and when he's revealed, his eyes are blood red. I'm talking vampire blood red. Marie Javins is a seasoned colorist, so I'm honestly not sure why the coloring looks so terrible on this book. I'm guessing that this was just colored in a rush, because man, does it look lame. The credits for both volumes also thank Alex Maleev for helping with the art, And this is something that throws me as well. I'll admit that I'm very unfamiliar with Maleev's 90s era artwork. I only encountered him in the early 2000s when he teamed with Brian Michael Bendis on Daredevil. According to his Wikipedia page, Maleev moved to the States in '95 and attended the Kubert School in New Jersey, so he was probably pretty new to the comics industry at the time. None of his modern style is prevalent in these books. Like, it almost looks like Gorney's pencils were either very loose or unfinished, or maybe they were very light, and so then the inker had to do more heavy lifting to finish the pages. The book's visuals change heavily from page to page, and that inconsistency does not help the book at all. Honestly, this little series is totally forgettable and kind of bad. The covers for the 2 volumes are awesome. The first one painted by Bob Wakelin, and the second designed by Cindy Emmert and painted by Steve Sampson. I do love the title font that they used there as well, which was designed by Todd Klein. But the story is overly convoluted, it is incredibly hard to follow, and the interiors of these comics are just ugly. Out of all of the comics that I'm going to be talking about in this streak of Western episodes, this is easily the worst looking out of all of them. There is some good character work, and I do feel that Nicieza does a great job introducing his cast and setting them up for further adventures. Unfortunately, those story elements were not enough to win him a follow-up series, and they are not good enough for me to recommend this book to anybody, for almost any reason. Very rarely do I wish that I hadn't purchased a comic book, but in this case, I actually think that I would have been fine missing it. Next week, when we return to the American West, we will do so in a very different way. Our tone is going to be much more realistic, our artwork is going to be darker and grittier, and we will be playing with the entirety of Marvel's Western history. Join me in a week for the end of Marvel's Western Legends, as they go down in the first part of Blaze of Glory. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.